and those who didn't. That was generally the two classes. But in Greek antiquity there arose a middle class, what I call a middle class anyway, of citizens. They didn't have tremendous wealth, but they had some wealth that gave them some independence, and they weren't slaves, and they weren't members of the oligarchy. And however, there were a substantial number of them, and they did demand some rights, which are to no middle section of society had been big enough or powerful enough to demand. And I believe democracy arose at that time in about the 5th, 6th century BC in the Greek city-states, specifically to meet the demands of this new and too powerful to ignore class within society, the citizens who did have some voting rights. It was only men, and it was only property-owning men, but nevertheless, that was the seeds for democracy. Now, my first question is, I'd like to just start there and ask you, do you think does that ring any bells for you? Does that seem a plausible theory?
Well, in the Greece in fifth century Athens, there was a middle class, and Aristotle writes about the middle class, but they are less expansive than the whole citizen body. He tends to see the citizen body as being made up of three groups: the rich, who he distinguishes from the middle class, a sort of group who he calls the middling sort, and then the ordinary people. And the ordinary people were members of the political community. They were members of the demos by virtue of their free birth. They were free-born Athenians, but they were certainly not sort of middle class in the conventional sense. And Aristotle tries, one of his sort of discussions of constitutions involves an attempt to sort of identify a constitutional form which gives a dominant role to the middle class. And the reason for this is to, part at least, to curb the excesses of the very rich, who he sees as being sort of greedy and irresponsible, and also the very poor, who are desperate and irresponsible. So it's sort of slightly more complicated than there just being a single middle class group, and you know, Athenian democracy was sort of a constant struggle between these various groups.
Yes, that middling sort, they. It's very interesting that he actually used that term way back then, and would you accept that is a middle class, the middling sort?
Well, I think that's one interpretation. That's one interpretation of it. I mean, Aristotle doesn't tend to although he regards wealth as being significant in terms of understanding political aspirations and political behaviour, he doesn't at least formally regarded as the sort of driving force. I mean, he's interested in the middle class because of the attributes that go with being people of that class. You know, relative degree of education, sort of moderate lifestyle, a concern with maintaining systems of law, and so on. So he's more interested in the attributes of citizenship, which he identifies with wealth, than with the mere fact of wealth itself.
I would go back before Aristotle to Plato, or even the Socratic period, because at that time the conditions that Aristotle's talking about were already there, weren't they? Well, I believe they were, and so maybe Aristotle was the first to notice it and put it down, being the rational sort of systematizer that he was. But nevertheless, looking back with the perspective from, way back from the 21st century, I would say that you can see that this middle sort had originated before him, and that the oligarchs, the rich or whatever he called them, the problem of dealing with them would go back maybe even to the 6th century, to Heraclitus and at that time. Wouldn't you say so? I mean, this wasn't something new to the Aristotelian period.
Well, I think it's something. No, I don't think it's new. It's a feature of, and it's not necessarily a feature of all Greek societies. Aristotle is concerned primarily with Athens, which was one of the richer of the societies. There would also be. He also sort of describes forms of democracy which are much more basic than Athenian democracy. They're more basic in the sense that the population is largely equal, and this is a sort of basic form of democracy which he regards as being actually a good thing, as opposed to other forms of democracy which he's dubious about. And what characterises this form of democracy, which he calls polity, which is a sort of generic name for the state, is that all the citizens are actually roughly the same. It's a sort of limited culture, and one could imagine this sort of environment existing in a sort of in a largely a wholly rural society made up of smallholders, and that's a model of democracy where which is really a reflection of a single class state rather than a much more sophisticated society such as Athens was.
Now, certainly the Spartans were not democratic, although they were Greeks. That's for sure. In fact, quite the opposite. Now, at this point, I want to introduce, we've touched on the aspect of equality, that essential to democracy is some rough equality of economic power. And that defines equality to me in general. But that's not enough, because yes, there were other societies that had enough people who had roughly equal power that they demanded roughly equal political power, and therefore there had to be some system to reflect that. But that wouldn't be a democracy. That would be a cooperative or something like that. To me, a democracy requires three classes. And the oligarchs, I believe, are just as essential to democracy as the middle class, and naturally no democracy can survive except by a functioning economy, and somebody's got to do all the work, the grunt work, and so there has to be a third class of workers, slaves, wage slaves, whatever you want to call them, who actually perform the work but don't have a lot of money, which is why they perform the work. Now, I think that it was the existence not only of a middle class but the persistence of a substantial but not powerful enough oligarchy or rich upper class in the Athenian state that really made the difference there, because it was that tension, and this is where another word comes in, another Greek word of Greek derivation. This is where a dialectic comes in, which is of course a very Marxist concept, and that is that you had a tension, a three-way tension here, which I believe is the essence of democracy. That is, you had a tension between the upper class and the middle class, because the middle class were more or less a threat to the upper class, because many members of the middle class, in the essence, all members of the middle class, essentially aspire to be upper class. This is a great motivating factor for the participation of the middle class in the system, and especially in the economy, is their aspirations to become upper class. And that in some ways is a threat and a tension with the upper class. And also the upper class fear the existence of the middle class in a political sense. So there is a fear there. On the other hand, the middle class fear the upper class, because that if they get too much power, the upper class will say, well, why are we mucking around with this rabble, this middle sort? Why don't we just take over? which of course is exactly what the upper class, or those who believe they have enough power to do so, have been doing ever since the beginning of time. If people believe they have enough economic power, they won't muck around. They'll take over politically, and usually, almost always, militarily. And the military themselves will use their military power to take over too, as they have done in Fiji, throughout Africa, South America, and down through history. So there's a real tension there between the upper class and the middle. But that can be a creative tension which maintains a creative balance, as long as neither of them get absolute and overriding power. And that's the second essential point, that there has to be an upper class, but there has to be a tension between them by which neither of them can completely dominate the situation. And of course, both of the middle and upper section have a tension with the lower class. Neither of them want to fall into the lower class, so they don't want to be rendered poor. And secondly, they don't want to work. I mean, ever since the Greek period, work has been seen as a punishment, a form of punishment. And certainly today, that's the overriding impression that people get. Now, there's my loose theory about the need for this upper class, and the need for this tension, and the need for balance between them.
Well, it's unclear whether the tension is a sort of cause or consequence, and there are moments in history where members of what we might call a middle class don't seem to aspire to become members of the upper class. If systems of kind of hierarchy are based upon birth or status, which is independent of wealth, then you might get situations where these aspirations are at least very strongly muted. So I don't think there's anything inevitable about those aspirations, or in the fact that those aspirations would express themselves in political terms. At least the process is a very slow process. If you think of the movement of the movement from medieval societies to early modern societies, political aspirations are often tied up not with sort of secular concerns, but with people's views about their religious obligations. So they're derivative rather than being primary. Modern work on the English Revolution of the 17th century, for example, focuses quite closely on the extent to which what we see as being a political struggle is actually a political manifestation of particular views about religious requirements. So from this point of view, this sort of analysis of tensions between classes in an economic sense doesn't necessarily seem to be what's going on. You might read it in that way, and it might have actually ended up taking that form, but certainly in significant stages, that's not the way in which people understood what they were contesting.
I could fully accept that it's any simplification will be wrong in the biggest, at some point, somewhere, somehow. But would you accept the general note that a tension between sections, although viewed negatively, most people view tension as a negative thing, is actually a positive, in the sense of if neither one gets overriding power, then that tension can lead to a form of balance, which surely is the best we can ever hope for in a social situation, is balance. And I'm thinking here, you mentioned medieval period, I'm thinking of the Magna Carta. I think that was that the 12th century? 13th century?
Yeah.
Yeah. And to me, that had nothing to do with the middle class, and nothing to do with the peasants either, as far as I can tell. But it was a tension, I'm not sure between whom, but where the landowning class sort of had to come to some sort of compromise, and they did that. They reflected the changing Maybe you can enlighten me a bit there, because most people see somehow the Magna Carta as some sort of giant leap towards the democracy, whereas personally I think it's a tributary, a side issue. It didn't really have anything to do with what we now call, the democratic state. What was going on there at that Magna Carta?
Well, I think I'm not a medieval specialist, but I think you're dead right. This is not a democratic. This is not a democratic moment. But insofar as it's a moment that has to do with the control of royal power, it does actually sort of set up a structure of governance which involves a fundamental change from the idea which was common in England before then and was common in Europe for a long time afterwards, views of royal absolutism and so on. And if you have such views, then it's very hard even to start thinking about democracy, because the participation even of other elites is regarded as being illegitimate. So I think from that point of view, it is sort of significant in the long term. It's also significant in the sense that the rights recognised have some sort of independent and perpetual status. They're not something that depends upon the will of the will of the monarch. So from that point of view, it's a sort of an interesting moment, but it's probably more interesting in terms of notions of constitutionalism than notions of democracy. And constitutionalism and democracy are not necessarily the same things, although democracies are constitutional forms of government.
Now, I think we've established that equality is an essential element of democracy, that there are groups of people who roughly consider themselves equal in a sense. That's one aspect that seems to nobody could contemplate a democracy where there was great inequalities.
But surely
yes.
there are huge inequalities in modern societies.
Oh, well, who's saying modern society is democratic? I'm trying to work up to that point. And, where we arrive at the modern times, where everyone considers with great pride and hubris that they live in democratic societies. Of course, I'm thinking of America primarily. And I would like to indicate with an historical perspective just how wrong that might be.
But when you talk about equality as a requirement, you have to ask the question which Aristotle asks, actually, equal with respect to what? And there's no suggestion in Aristotle that people should be equal with respect to wealth, or that that's a requirement, or that the Athenians thought that their democracy rested on that. Their democracy rests upon equality with respect to free birth. This is the quality that all citizens need to possess. So when one talks about members of a democratic community having to have some quality in common, something which they all share, one needs to kind of identify what that particular quality is. And I don't think that at any moment, or any moment in Western European history, that quality would be equality of wealth. It may well be that the avoidance of extremes of inequality is a necessary condition. Certainly in terms of the practice of democracy, the idea of significant material equality doesn't seem to be part of the equation.
Now, well, this is where I show my true colours, as they say, which I suppose are red. All my life, because of my bias, I've always thought that talk about equality, and in fact talk about any judgment laid upon people in a political or socio-economic sense of any description that doesn't touch on their economic situation is hollow talk, because I truly believe that money talks, always has done. It is a power in itself, and in the end the fundamental power ever since it was invented. and before money was land, which was the economic resource, a primary economic resource, but it was the economic resource which underlies the power structure of a social situation. And power, in the end, throughout nature, you can go right through the animals down to quantum physics if you want to, or out to the last quasar at the edge of the universe. It's just power. It's a play. It's a power play. There is my bias. Now, when you said that the middle class, how do we define equality? After all, the Athenians weren't defining it in terms of economic influence. I put it to you that they were in the end, because if they had your freeborn citizen who had ostensibly the rights of any other freeborn citizen, and in that sense equal, but if they had greatly unequal, if they'd fallen on hard times and their farm had been sold, or the Spartans had overrun it, or whatever, as opposed to another group who still had a reasonable economic income, and a dozen slaves under them or whatever, that in reality the poor citizen did not have the power and influence within the Greek demos and overall structure than as opposed to the reasonably well-off, still well-off citizen. And at those times, right up to the present day, that the political system, to a greater or lesser extent, it's only rough, it's not direct, but in the end it will reflect the economics underneath, the power structure of the economy underneath the citizens. And those who have got that power will, in the end, insist on having that reflected in the political system.
Well, I mean, the way you put that, it's pretty conditioned. I mean, when people talk about in the end, it leaves a whole lot of intermediary positions. The end might never come. Yeah, I mean, this is not anywhere near as straightforward as you're trying to suggest. I mean,
No doubt.
I have a reasonably good salary, compared with some other people in New Zealand. I would have to say that they would probably regard me as being well off, but this has no political implications at all. It's a matter of there is something else going on here. Wealth needs at least to be mediated through processes. There's nothing straightforward. There's nothing straightforward about this. So I think the simple story is only true if one kind of eliminates all possible conditions, and it's the conditions that actually make the difference between how things operate. And I think that one would need to differentiate the areas in which people have influence, or the steps that they have to take to have influence, and they're not automatically connected with what their income might be.
No, it's not automatic, but you see, I want to point out, perhaps the greatest scientific discovery of all was Newton's theories of gravity and force and acceleration and mass and things like that. All of those theories are completely abstracted from conditions. What they're saying is, in the conditions of no friction and only two bodies, the following laws will apply. Well, of course, there's nowhere in the universe where you find no friction and only two bodies interacting. And yet we still consider it to this day to be a fantastic discovery. And it is. It has its great uses, although strictly speaking, it never applies. Now, if we are going to talk at all about theories and generalizations and attempts by the human mind to understand anything, we do have to abstract it somewhat from the fully conditioned whole that we actually find ourselves in. So I make no apologies for making my theories conditional on abstracting it from this or that condition and making statements about the end. Because my observations and readings of history are that there is an end. Eventually, in a bigger, it's messy, but you can see a directionality in the situation that does tend to reflect the economy of the situation, the economics, the rising economic class in a messy, backward, two steps forward, one step back way, but it does through time, the economy will have its way politically. That's all I'm really trying to say. That economics is primary to politics, not the other way around. What do you think there?
Well, I mean, economics in itself doesn't do anything. What we're talking about here are people who are acting in particular ways within particular structures, I think one needs to. I don't think the Newton analogy really works here, because there are conditions under which Newton's theory holds, but the position that you're putting forward ignores all the conditions that might be applied to it. And I think one needs to, Marx always strikes me as being sort of quite plausible and quite interesting, and there is certainly something there, and at certain stages in history, that form of explanation works better than at other stages in history. But in many occasions, in some ways, the analysis is at such a high level that it's actually quite difficult. That it doesn't actually. It doesn't. Well, its explanatory value is limited by that, because you then have to bring in a whole bunch of other things, which I think the 17th century is actually a very good example of this. I mean, there have been schools of historiography and historians of political thought who've lined up in a sort of Marxist way and in various revisionist ways. At one time, the Marxists were the revisionists, and then they became the sort of defenders of the faith as new waves of revisionism came in. And that sort of, I've often thought that debate, which is still in some sense ongoing, is actually quite an interesting indication of the dangers of taking that high level position, because it does become quite sort of reductionist, and it avoids the needs to look at things and explain them, because you already have the answer. It's always reducible to something else. Now, even if that's true, and I'm not sure about that, it doesn't actually explain what's going on, because in different circumstances those forces will play themselves out in a variety of different ways. So although the underlying impetus might be the same, we're no further ahead in explanation, because one's got to unpack how this actually works out in the way that people understand themselves, the way that they present what they're doing, the way that other people understand what they're doing. I mean, for example, it might be true that one can actually identify forms of radical Protestantism with capitalism or individualism and so on. That may or may not be true. But in doing that, you don't avoid the need to actually explain how those claims are worked out in a particular society, and how people respond to them, and how not just those individuals but also other people see things in these terms, and regard economic or sort of political things as being consequences, rather than being what the fundamental kind of argument is about. So it's not that I would necessarily deny the proposition you're putting forward, but I would question whether in many circumstances it gets us much further forward in terms of explaining things. And actually Marx is an interesting case in this, because when Marx wrote those journalistic pieces about the 1848 revolutions and Louis Napoleon and so on, which I think are among his best pieces, what you get there is actually very sophisticated political analysis. He assumes that there's this large pattern going on, but he doesn't just keep referring to that. He actually gets into a whole range of other modes of explanation in order to show how these patterns work out at a particular moment in time.
Now, in previous programs I've interviewed philosophers, and we've had the philosophical debate about is there really anything out there, where the postmodernists would say no, everything's specific and the rules are the rules that apply at that particular situation, and the more conservative Platonic type would say, well, no, there is something out there and it's fundamentally running through, and it's, if we can understand that, then we do have some understanding about how things are going to go. Now, I don't want to have that, because I've had that. That's a philosophical debate. I'm on the directionality thing. I'm very much not a postmodernist where everything is just relative to the exact situation. Nevertheless, if we jump forward to the current or the 20th century leading up to where we are now, and accept your argument about, well, Marx, you know, when he did use his general theories, but not in an absolute way, but he was actually referring to a particular situation, he could do a good analysis. I'm no Marx, but I've got to do my best, and I think that the 20th century, after the Second World War, when the society was shaken up dramatically, and you know, countries had a lot different power structure to when they went in. Obviously Germany was a hell of a lot weaker than when it came out of the war than when it went in. If no other conclusion would be drawn, that's one of them. And the United States was a lot more potent in the world scene after the war than it was before. Would you accept that?
Oh, I think that's undeniable, yeah.
Undeniable, great. Well, we've got solid ground there. Now, I think that after the Second World War, before as well, you know, right from the beginning of the American Revolution and Civil War, there was an establishment there of the middle class, as America was the, you know, this is where the middle class flourished. This was a new country. The middle class came out from the Europe. I've got a lot of workers did too, but a substantial number of you know, opportunist people who wanted to set up in business. The classic middle class scenario came out from Europe, and you know, opened up as best they could. Some of them became very wealthy, but the majority didn't. But they were reasonably well off. Now, after the Second World War, America, with its newfound colonies, more or less, or anyway, its newfound economic power, was able to sustain for 40 years or so, 30 anyway, you know, they were able to buy off working class problems with the working class, not by just giving more wages and buckling under great pressure, which was the pre-war environment where the working class organised and, you know, violently opposed until they got something that they wanted. America went a better way and just said, well, look, didn't say it, but we've got enough money here to make everyone middle class, more or less, and suburbia is where they live. You know, it's a new sort of equal environment where everyone is fairly well off and they've got security, and if you really want to work hard, you can jump up into the business class, and some of them jump up even further and become super rich. And so America was able to buy off, with its newfound resources, its social problems. Basically, the tensions between the working class, the middle class and the upper class were able to be ameliorated greatly. Now, in the 21st century, those resources are no longer available, neither in America or anywhere else. And now the middle class is under a great deal of pressure, and it's going to go into some sort of open revolt. Now, I think that the middle class tension, positive tension between it and the upper class to keep the upper class in bounds, fell over for about 40 years. The oligarchs, the super rich, had more or less unconstrained control for a considerable period of time, and the middle class accepted that because the crumbs were enough to keep them happy. Now that the trickle-down effect is greatly slowing, there is a real problem with letting the very, very well-off run the place. And there's not only going to be problems with democracy within the United States itself, but this political thesis that we should export democracy from its centres in Europe and in North America into all of those trouble spots throughout the world, primarily the Middle East, but also Africa, South America, and all of this. That whole ethos that democracy is the silver bullet that we can export as advanced nations is also utterly useless, because, worse than useless, because none of those, very few of them, have a middle class in which democracy can flourish, from which democracy can flourish. That as soon as you try to export the democracy, apart from the fact that it's collapsing in Europe and America and England anyway, apart from that, as soon as you try to export it into the Middle East or into most countries in Africa or in South America, the upper class or the military there will accept it under duress, but as soon as they get an opportunity, they'll say, more or less, not consciously, there is no middle class here to oppose us. Why are we mucking around with this voting stuff where all of these nobodies get in the way? And they just take over again and impose direct rule by the well-off over the not so well-off, which has been the history, of all but a few states since the beginning. Now, for that reason, that's why I think this whole talk about democracy, our reliance on democracy, is very, very dangerous, very weak position at this moment in history, because of its weak position within the Americas and Europe, and because of its impossible position within the so-called Third World and the Middle East and those other countries. And a totally un-Marxist position I've had to arrive at and accept, and that is that the middle class, far from being the enemy, which Marx, the petty bourgeois, they were purged everywhere socialism came in, mainly because I think socialism was another two-class system. The socialists and the rest, it wasn't democratic. And so the middle class were in the way of socialists as much as they are in the way of the super rich. And so they were eliminated in both situations. And so, but now I've come to the position where I do think democracies are damn good. I think it is the only thing that stands between us and, some sort of autocracy, or worse, the French Revolution, which, took all power structure away and resulted in terrible chaos until Napoleon brought a power structure back, which was just a dictatorship, which worked for quite a while. So I place a lot of emphasis on the middle class. I am middle class, despite my upbringings. I think that a middle class is essential to a civilized system. I think it is a greatly civilizing sense, not if it has direct rule, but in its tension with the other classes. And I fear that unless the middle class realise this, that we're going to fall back into either autocracy, the evil of two lessers, which is autocracy or chaos. They're the two alternatives. If you take out the middle and the two ends meet, the upper and the lower, you really have a very uncivilized society. That's my grand thesis.
Well, there's a whole. You're making a whole range of points there. I think one of the issues here, which is often neglected by commentators, is that they forget that things actually take time to happen, and that relatively stable forms of government in Western European countries took quite a long time to evolve. We think of France as being a sort of stable society. It certainly wasn't thought of in that way, not just during the Revolution, but actually for significant periods of the 19th century. So the arrival of stable democratic political culture has been quite a long time coming in the places that we now associate it with, even with the United States, in fact. So I'd have thought that your idea about it not being a silver bullet is perfectly true, but it's never proved to be a silver bullet anywhere, if that means it's delivered very quickly. Trying to change political cultures by military means is obviously a very fraught experiment. Largely, I suppose, because it doesn't actually address the issues. The political culture still has, the underlying political culture still has those characteristics which give rise to sort of tension and extreme forms of tension. I'd have thought that I don't have any particular information on this, but I'd have thought developments in South America are quite interesting in this respect, where even in the time that I can remember, there has been quite a significant shift in the political cultures, or at least the outcomes of the political cultures of a number of South American countries in the 70s and even in the 80s. One always associated them with coups and sort of brief interludes of not really democratic government but populist government, and then followed by military intervention. But that pattern seems in many of those countries to be changing. Now, how long this will last, or how long it will take to become established, is a sort of question. But I think there are some shifts there, and which point to some of what you see as being the sort of the favourable benefits of the emergence of a strong and sort of, I think, not just strong but actually relatively confident middle class is one of the would be one of the requirements, because at least from a sort of outsider's view, the intervention of the military was kind of very rarely done wholly at the behest of the upper classes. There was always significant middle class support, because of course what hurts the middle classes gives the upper classes gives the middle classes a terrible fright in economic terms. But I'd have thought that in South America, at least, there's probably some signs of change there. Now, that's taken a long time, and probably, if you think about it, 150 or 180 years. So one could not expect rapid change elsewhere, and this is seems to be one of the problems of American policy. The idea that these things happen very quickly. They actually tend to take quite a lot of time, and they're never as smooth as at present as they might appear to have been in retrospect.
I take some comfort in the fact that you talked about South America, because I spent some time there in 76, 77, and looking through it through my rose-tinted glasses, of course. But looking back now, I believe that that stability that you do see starting to happen is of two sorts. First, the instability was due to the fact that there was no substantial middle class there. I mean, when I was in Rio and Sao Paulo and Buenos Aires, and you'd see this unbelievable wealth right next to unbelievable poverty, and bugger all in between in many occasions. Peru would be a classic there, Colombia. And that, looking back now, I believe my thesis comes a bit from that if you don't have that middle class, you just get either open revolt, which Colombia is a classic, or you get open dictatorship, brutal dictatorship, and bugger all in between. And with the emergence over the years since then, I mean, that's 40 years ago, 30 years ago, since then there has been a far more substantial small business sector has developed, and that its need for stability and has slowed things down a bit. But if you take it has stabilised things where democracy is able to grow in a hesitant way, and that's what we are seeing. But if you take Bolivia and Venezuela, where there isn't a substantial middle class, Venezuela might have, but apparently not big enough. There really, you've got stability on the basis that the lower and working classes have more or less won. They've had huge struggles through the years in both those countries, especially in Bolivia. But at this point, the working classes and the peasants and the poor have matured through many, many years of struggles and all of that, and thrown up leaders, and actually have the predominant political influence within those countries at this point in time. That this isn't democracy in the way that we see it. It's more of a socialism, a socialist democracy, you see. It's not the sort of democracy that we think, which unconsciously is a middle-class democracy. And I don't believe America supports socialist, working-class dominated democratic states. They never say so, but I don't believe Britain does either. And in fact, hardly anybody does except other ones. And that's why Venezuela and Bolivia, although they're becoming quite democratic in a way, they are vehemently and aggressively opposed by the very countries who say democracy is a good thing. And that's because they are democracy for the working, you see, it's not a middle class democracy. And that's, again, I know I'm drawing broad boundaries there, but South America is a very good test tube for the various kinds of democracy, the problems for it, its slow growth. But I do accept your point about the slowness of change, yes.
Well, I'm not an expert in this area, but I mean, there's a sort of hysteria of the left and a hysteria of the right about the rates of change, and the Americans are often gripped in a hysteria of the right, whereas other people are gripped in a hysteria of the left. I mean, I would imagine that I would imagine that the American reaction to Venezuela probably has more to do with their geopolitical interest than it does with the concern with the internal regime. And large, powerful states have these interests, and they tend to skew their views of developments within the areas in which they're interested. I mean, one of the things that, in some ways, what seems to be happening in countries like Venezuela in a much shorter time frame are the sorts of things that happen in Western European countries over the sort of period about 1815 to 1900, where, for a whole variety of reasons, the more of the resources of the community were dedicated to the well-being of the ordinary members of those populations in terms of education, healthcare, and so on. And there doesn't seem, in terms of the outcomes, there doesn't seem to be a huge amount of difference between these two examples.
No, I agree with you entirely. My revelation, the reason I'm here, motivated, talking to you about it, is that I've had to have a sea change in my simplistic perspective, which I was brought up with, and it's always difficult to change one's upbringing, and that was that the middle class, I believe, is an essential element even to socialism, even to the socialist democracy, because without it, though people like, who are great socialist leaders inevitably build, as in Cuba, as is happening now in as Venezuela, as is happening now in Bolivia, that leadership people have and are making political changes to centre power around their particular inner circle and bring the military into that inner circle. And that increasingly the trend will be and is in those three countries away from what we consider a democracy, which is that equality and that equal opportunity right sort of throughout society, that they will become basically a two-class state. There'll be the ruling class, who are the socialists and the members of their ever-expanding party, the Socialist Party, whatever they call it. They will become an elite, and then you'll have all of the rest. The rich, the poor, and the middle class will be more or less kept out of that group and treated as a lump. And it will be quite a forceful thing. And I experienced that in Russia, in the Soviet Union as it was then in 1977. I spent 12 months there, and much to my horror and dispelling all of my illusions and dreams, I found that the Communist Party of the Soviet Union had formed an elite aristocracy within that country, and that they had party cards which they, were just like badges of privilege, and they used them accordingly. And it was really a two-state structure and far from democratic. So that's when my pessimism began about that, and I suppose the sea change, that you do need that middle section, or the middle sort, as Aristotle called it.
Yeah, I wonder. I wonder at the. I wonder about the. I mean, Russia since the revolution seems never to have been democratic, except perhaps for a few months. So that doesn't seem to be a fair test of this sort of movement from one form of autocracy to another. Partly as a consequence of external pressure and economic requirements of economic development and so on, but the outcome is still the same. I mean, it would be interesting to look at the evolution of the political system in places like Venezuela. I'm not sure that that's a necessary outcome. The Russian case is, and the Chinese case too, sort of quite distinctive given the characteristics of the regime that was replaced and the social structure in those societies. It'd be interesting to see whether places like Venezuela will evolve as sort of regular sort of democratic polities, which means that you get changes in personnel and changes in policy, as has kind of happened relatively quickly actually in Nicaragua from what one sees from the outside. So I don't think the movement to autocracy is an inevitable one. It has happened in some places, but in places like Venezuela, I guess the jury is still out, and one would have to know more than I do about how the leadership there, Chavez and so on, actually works, like what the political system is like. One sees the outward effects of it, and one sees the Americans' response to this, but one doesn't have any conception of how the machinery works internally. The Americans tend usually to criticize him in terms of his economic policy and in terms of his impact on the region, rather than in terms of kind of fundamental domestic issues, such as human rights and due process and so on, which are usually associated with democracy. So I would have thought that that's an indication that the sort of conventional political processes are still working there, at least at the moment.
It is really just my prediction that if Chavez keeps going the way he is, which is building his party to be a one-party state, which is definitely what he's heading for, that will inevitably turn into a more dictatorial situation, I believe. And that is because here's where I put something specific on the table as being a more positive way forward than is currently being suggested or apparently thought about. And that is that contrary to the opinion of socialists, democracy really requires that capitalism is there within the state. And capitalism in the sense that people own something and are able to employ it in the way that they see fit in the pursuit of economic well-being. and that ownership, private ownership, does exist. It can't be just abolished, and it's a good thing to have that, because that allows the equality and some measure of hope and autonomy for a substantial section of the society, a growing one, which we loosely call the middle class, the middle sort. And that it's in that bed that the democracy with the equality, the equal opportunity, the civilization as we know it with its code of Christian ethics, or even Islamist, any religion, any modern religion, if you look at it and boil it down, the codes all come from sort of Abraham and anyway. So, there's no problem there with sort of lining up what civilization sort of means, really. And that's what we all have to grasp, that being super rich is not the answer. Dispelling private property and making everybody propertyless as a form of equality is definitely not the answer, but that having a middle section of which more and more people can aspire to, and some well off, and not having huge numbers of poor, is the answer to the political problems that we have, and that we should be promoting not richness and not just focusing on poverty, but that we should all accept, socialists included, workers included, right-wingers included, that this middle section is absolutely essential to the way forward for a peaceful political, worldwide political system.
Okay, well, you've certainly come a long way, haven't you? I think what you say raises interesting questions. I'm not sure that they. I'm not sure. One way to look at this is to actually to move away from questions of economic structures and so on, or at least to put them to one side for the time being, and to ask kind of questions about what material requirements have to be satisfied if people are able to develop the characters which are necessary to sustain democratic regimes. And one would imagine that these characteristics would rule out desperate poverty, would require a certain level of education, would require people to have a sense of their own worth and so on, and a sense of their value as people with independent members of the community. And I think underlying your point is the more fundamental one, in a sense that most of those requirements are incompatible with with extreme unregulated capitalism, and are precluded by most forms of anti-property socialism. In historical terms, the position that you're putting forward doesn't sound actually all that different from some sort of advanced 19th century liberals, both from the New Zealand tradition.
That nearly chokes me, but you're probably right.
And from the British tradition. People like Robert Stout and so on, and the British equivalents of those people. That was essentially their view, it does seem to be, at least it begs the question of how you then control, or what controls it might be necessary to impose upon economic activity, so that those preconditions aren't destroyed. But it does have the value of establishing what those preconditions might be, and sort of setting a basic line which societies which expect to be sort of reasonably functioning democracies have to satisfy. And one doesn't need to look to the extremes of sort of Iraq, or countries in Africa and so on. One sees signs of this in other communities. in the United States, for example, and in certain sort of localized situations, the sort of systems of discrimination which prevent people acquiring those either those material characteristics or having an opportunity to exercise them effectively, make it virtually impossible for democracy to operate. I mean, you could read the Northern Irish situation in the 1960s and so on, or from the 1920s through until the late 20th century in those terms. So it's actually a sort of a precondition which applies in a whole range of different circumstances.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you. I mean, I think we've arrived at a point of complete agreement, although, yeah, I'm a classic liberal.